As of this morning, it looks like President Biden is getting a chance to fulfill his campaign promise to nominate a new Supreme Court justice with the right racial and chromosomal characteristics. But before he decides that, he must figure out what to do about the Russian threat to invade Ukraine. And in the meanwhile, the inflation that the president originally said would be temporary is instead galloping ahead, hitting low-income Americans the worst. We're going to talk about these challenges and more on today's episode of Independent Outlook. Hello, everybody. I'm Graham Walker, coming to you today from the Independent Institute in Oakland, California, right across the bay from San Francisco, where we try and give you a take on the issues of the day that does not really fit into standard categories, but instead takes an independent look at things. And so today, for this conversation, I'm joined by my two colleagues, as ever. First of all, David Theroux, founder and president of the Independent Institute. Greetings, David.
Greetings to you and to everyone.
It's a pleasure to see David Theroux. He's sitting in front of a bookcase full of books published over the last 30-some years by the Independent Institute, of which we are justly proud. And also joined today by my other colleague, Williamson Evers, Bill Evers, who is the director of our Center on Educational Excellence. Hello, Bill. How are you doing today?
Very good. Thank you. Very well.
Great to see you. So let's talk about the unexpected breaking headline this morning. We weren't really going to talk about this originally, but all of a sudden, it seems that the oldest member of the U.S. Supreme Court, Justice Stephen Breyer, who is 83 years old, has announced his plan to retire. I don't think, at least I haven't as yet seen a specific date when this intended retirement would take effect, but nevertheless, it's coming out today that this is his plan. My first question about this, and maybe I'll turn to David Theroux first on this, there's been a lot of pressure on Justice Breyer ever since the election of Joseph Biden to retire. A lot of pressure, but why suddenly now, do you think, David?
The reason is, I think the initial reason is because of the midterms coming up. They're afraid of losing the Senate. They want to get someone in there before they lose the Senate. And they want, Biden had this promise and he's been failing on many of his promises, and the ones he has lift up on, he's proved to be a disaster in implementing them. I think there are other possible reasons too, which we can speculate on, but I think that's the major reason.
So
I concur. So Biden made this promise during his debate with Bernie Sanders. And Sanders, by the way, was unwilling to make such I think, racial discriminatory promise.
Yep.
Jonathan Turley, the frequent commentator on matters jurisprudential and judicial, wrote back in March of 2020 that he thought this was a very bad idea. He says, the Supreme Court has always been treated as a place for the best legal minds who stand objective above their peers in intellect and ability. And he doesn't think that this kind of racial pledge and sex pledge comports with that. And it's part of the continued invasion of identity politics. Obviously, this is a political appointment, but it's also an appointment to the judiciary, which we want to see as independent and objective as possible. And so he opposed it. Now, before we go into who may replace Breyer.
Oh, we all want to talk about that.
Well, no, let's say a little bit about Breyer and how he's not as good as everybody says. So, yeah, it was a kind of a solid liberal, but as opposed to a black letter law person, in other words, interpret the words of the thing or the original meaning or whatever, he had a approach to interpretation that was, I think, rightly denounced by constitutional scholar Richard Epstein. And Epstein said, look, Breyer says that we the court, we the interpreters of the laws, should try to make the law, whatever the wording says, fit with our assumption of the intentions and purposes of the legislators. And he says, not only can you not know this, not only are the legislators, possibly many years in the past when the courts come to interpret things. But this is a disincentive in a way for legislators. They should try to write clearly. So the plain meaning of the law is what the courts are determining things based on. And, it's an endless, fruitless quest that's going to lead the courts astray and into political quagmires.
Yeah, he's a pragmatist.
Yes, that's what Breyer was, a pragmatist, and not the worst guy on the court, but certainly not the best.
I mean, given that he's a pragmatist, maybe his decision right now to retire or resign is kind of an implicit signal that he thinks the Democrats are going to lose the Senate later this year, and certainly maybe the presidency 2 years later.
I agree with you, Graham, and I agree with David on this. But on the other hand, I think we should turn to the potential nominees, and I think the two most important ones are.
Oh, but wait. What about my favorite one? Okay. I know you have more serious ones, but I can't help mentioning before you talk about them, Bill.
Yeah.
Mentioning the idea, what about our sitting Vice President, Kamala Harris, former Attorney General of California? I mean, she has some qualifications.
You don't have to appoint a judge. Although in recent decades that's been the case, you actually don't even have to appoint a lawyer. It's not in the Constitution, but the custom in recent years has been judges from federal appeals courts. So she's not that, but it's a way to get rid of her because she's a drag on the ticket for them. She's more unpopular. It seems like a
perfect solution to solve two problems at the same time.
It's not. Here's
why not, Bill?
Because they only have, with her vote, the 51 vote margin in the Senate. If she leaves the Senate, it's tied, and they have
50-50.
They have to replace her departing her post of vice president with a new person. So that's done
according
by Congress.
to this is 25th Amendment, second article, majority vote of both houses approves a newly nominated vice president in the event of the resignation of a vice president.
Okay, so let's say they're trying to do this before the midterm vote. They're now with 50-50. And what is McConnell's incentive to go along with this? He has no incentive. He'd rather have it tied. And so the Democrats know that. So they're not going to lose that one vote that they desperately need in the Senate.
I think they would lose a number of Republican votes who would vote for him.
Yeah, if they did that. Yeah,
yes.
It's true. But I mean, the thing is, technically,
they would lose the 51 vote majority.
Because they'd put a new person as vice president. That person would be the 51st.
Yes, but first, the person has to get a majority vote to be.
Yeah, and McConnell wouldn't move it on the floor. He'd just.
Well, anyway.
But couldn't Vice President Kamala Harris, after she's been confirmed as the upcoming replacement?
No. Once you're confirmed,
Justice Breyer.
Once you're confirmed, I don't think you can do that.
All right.
Anyway, we're not expert enough to know the protocol of that, but I think it's too perilous, and Turley also thinks the same thing. So I don't think it's going to happen.
Okay, so tell us about some of the more plausible solutions, if you don't like mine.
All right. So one of them is Leandra Kruger, and she's a justice on the California Supreme Court, and so she was a clerk for John Paul Stevens, who was a kind of in the kind of moderate establishment Republican camp, but over the years became more and more liberal. And she was Deputy Solicitor General for the Obama administration, which is an extremely high position. It's the number 2 position of who appears for the federal government in court. And so she's liked by both Senate staff, Democratic side Senate staffers, and lawyers from the Obama administration. The other candidate that you hear a lot about is Ketanji Brown Jackson. and she's a judge on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. So people usually say she's in the D.C. Circuit Court. And she was a clerk for Stephen Breyer. So it's, that figures emotionally in some of these people's support. And she was recently elevated to the circuit court. And when she was elevated, she was voted for by Murkowski, Senators Murkowski, Collins, and Lindsey Graham.
Crucial.
So they all voted for her. Now, of course, they can turn around and vote against her, but that was very recent, months ago. So here's another interesting thing about her, and this is in Reason, online Reason magazine, an article by Damon Root, and he points out that Jackson voted in a qualified immunity case. So a demonstrator was yelling obscene words, but in a kind of a political speech context. And the police arrested this demonstrator, and the demonstrator sued for false arrest. And the policeman said, no, I have qualified immunity. And she said, no, you don't. And you violate somebody's constitutional rights in this jurisdiction, you don't have any qualified immunity. So I'm sure she has other things that are problems, but that's a good sign.
Yeah, I'm going to change the subject in a second, but I would like to say that one thing that does grieve me about this is you're reciting some of the interesting traits, in some cases virtues, of these African-American female judges who could well be appointed to the court. But because President Biden has made this commitment that it has to be a Black woman, it sheds a totally unnecessary filter of skepticism over these otherwise very qualified nominees. I'd like these women to be considered on their own merits, not because he's made some pledge about race and sex. It's a shame.
We had
it's a shame.
Sandra Day O'Connor. Has some similarities to that.
Yeah. And also, I think the point that they also want to communicate is that race is a key criteria.
Yes, they do.
And if you don't pay attention to that, then you're supremacist, white supremacist.
Right. So I think David's actually quite right. But of course, the court is caught in a very strange bind because they're voting on things like racial preferences and admissions. They have a case that involves both a private university and the public university. So it's Harvard and University of North Carolina. And, my view is you can differentiate between how decision-making and admissions is made in private versus public universities. But the point is, it's weird for the court to be seen and viewed and decided on this racial filter when it's trying to decide about the civil rights issues that are before it.
Well, right. I do anticipate that later this year, we will have a number of conversations here about these cases that are making their way inexorably through the court's docket on abortion, gun rights, affirmative action, and more. So stay tuned for more on these.
The other factor, I think, is that the polls show that Blacks are increasingly turning against Biden.
Blacks and Hispanics.
And I think this is going to be used as a symbol that Biden is, I guess he would be the third Black president after Clinton, Obama, and then Biden.
All right, so I'm glad we're preserving our sense of humor
here. Yes.
Okay, change subject. There are over 100,000 Russian troops massed around Ukraine on three sides.
Right.
Russia already controls now the Crimea and apparently has re-annexed it, whatever the international legal status of that annexation may be. President Biden, of course, he's thinking about the Supreme Court, but he's probably thinking a whole lot more about Ukraine right now. I mean, I think we should all actually literally hold President Biden in our prayers. This is a tough time.
Yeah.
But how did we get here is the question. Is it necessary that we're on the brink of apparent military conflict with another superpower?
the way we got here goes back to the end of the Cold War.
Mhm.
So the Cold War is ending in the Reagan, George H.W. Bush years. And so the Soviet Union breaks up under Gorbachev and Yeltsin. And what's going to happen to NATO? And what's going to happen to these former Soviet socialist republics?
Mhm.
So NATO was formed to block the Soviet Union and block it from going across the North German plain, and maybe to kind of have a bit of a military restraint on Germany. Some people say it's to keep US in, Russia out, and Germany down, as they'll say. But anyway, the point is they could have just ended it right then, NATO, because
Right.
the purpose was gone.
Well,
Or-
the Warsaw Pact had ended.
Yeah. So as our foreign policy specialist at Independent Institute, Ivan Elon, says, they could have either ended it, which would have been perfectly appropriate, or they could have expanded it to include Russia, take out the military component, and just have it as a forum for settling disputes in Europe, which would have been a perfectly reasonable thing to do. But they didn't. So the US began to have sort of triumphalist visions. And Russia, which was originally kind of open to the idea of some kind of, I don't know, association with NATO, began backing off. And there were a number of reasons. And a lot of it had to do with former Yugoslavia, which also broke up in the same time period, the late 80s and into the 90s.
Mm-hmm.
And Russia had had a long time. This goes back to before World War I. I mean, in a sense, World War I is a product of Russian, Austrian and German strange assertiveness, and particularly Russian flamboyant assertiveness. So Russia thought, well, we're friends with Serbia and we're fellow Slavs, and we should be running foreign policy in the Balkans. And so that's how the different countries got in strange situations they couldn't really get out of and went to war with each other. So just to say what happened, the US interfered with both. So the Bosnian Serbs wanted to leave Bosnia-Herzegovina, and the US monkeyed around in that, and the Russians were trying to help the Serbs get some kind of autonomy. And then 4 years later, the Albanians wanted to leave Serbia. They were in the province of Kosovo, and the US militarily intervened. And it really got antagonistic when the Russians, with being allowed to do so by the Serbian government, occupied an airport in Serbia while NATO was militarily fooling around in there trying to facilitate the secession of Kosovo from Serbia. So this, really irritated the Russians, along with all the expansion of NATO eastward. So Poland, the Baltic states,
Yep. Czech
Estonia,
Republic, Hungary.
all those states, and all rubbed the Russians the wrong way. This was their former sphere of influence, their cordon that kept them from being too close to the West. And so all those Western military forces were moving closer to them. And in the case of Ukraine, which the US promised, first we gave security guarantees under Carter. Then under George H.W. Bush, we promised that they would get in. Then under Trump, who said he wasn't, or who left. So there was a big dispute about the Republican platform when Trump was first running for president, whether to say that the U.S. was committed to sending lethal weaponry to the Ukraine. And the Trump people just wanted it left out, and with the possible implication, maybe we don't want to do this, but we certainly don't want to pledge to do this. And the foreign policy establishment went bonkers, saying this proves that Trump is a terrible isolationist and that he doesn't want to go to war in the Ukraine.
Right. Trump is a dove, not a hawk.
This is all coming back now with Tucker Carlson versus Fiona Hill or Pompeo or whatever. So
my head spins because when I was younger, I was used to those on the so-called right were, big military pro-war, and those on the left were anti-war. But now things are very different.
There's a split on the right.
Yeah, there is.
And
on the left.
There's another position that's sort of a right position, which is the George H.W. Bush, James Baker position. So when the Soviet Union was falling apart, they wanted to stop that. In other words, they wanted Ukraine to be in the same governmental sphere as Russia, the Russian Federation of today. They didn't want to break up with the Soviet Union. So if they had had their way, this wouldn't be an issue at all. I'm saying, it's better for the Ukrainians to be independent, but they also have to bear in mind of their geographical situation. They are in the front yard of Russia. They are in the path of many, many invasions of history into the Russian heartland. They're a weak country economically. They're a divided country politically, and they shouldn't just accept miracles.
In 2008, George W. Bush asserted that countries, including Ukraine, would eventually be accepted into NATO. Last year, Joseph Biden reiterated that claim. And it seemed that Biden's reiteration of George W. Bush's assertion triggered the anxiety and the aggressiveness, which seems to be resulting in today's action.
I think so, but I also think Putin has domestic political things.
It helps him.
He's up for re-election. He wants to be president for life. He wants to be seen as a heroic defender of Russia, and he has so many domestic problems, so many economic problems, that appearing to be a military defender, is really his best card right now politically.
It seems to me that Tucker Carlson is onto something when he questions why it's essential to American national interest and security that Ukraine be eligible for NATO. But at the same time, I can't help but worry that that very public argument could seem to validate Putin's aggression and totalizing ambitions. It's a complicated situation.
Yeah, it's very complicated. I mean, Putin may just, I got one little point out here, David, hang on one second. I'm sorry. Putin may have this, not wanting Ukraine and NATO. I'm sure that's the case. And Ross Douthat has said, well, he's a columnist in the New York Times, said, why not just put that on hold for 25 years and make that explicit? And who knows where the world will be in 25 years.
Not such a bad idea.
But the U.S. won't agree.
Right.
Well, I know, but it's still a good idea.
No, I'm not saying that they shouldn't. I'm just saying so far they've refused.
No, that's right. The U.S. is point blank refused, and the other NATO countries are not really going along with this. But just to say, another short-term goal of Putin's is he may well have been worried that the Ukrainians were planning to have a military offensive against the breakaway regions in eastern Ukraine that are heavily Russian speaking and are occupied by pro-Russian secessionists.
Well, he's also worried about losing the base on the Black Sea. That would become a NATO base. I mean, literally, the similarity is that Western NATO US forces are on Russia's borders in Europe.
How can we expect them to like that?
And the concern that Americans would have is the same thing about Putin said, that if you don't back off on the Ukraine, I'm going to send Russian troops to Cuba and Venezuela.
Right.
And of course,
he was trying to say, look, in reality, there are spheres of influence. We kind of don't admit to them, including the Russians not really admitting to them, but they are there.
And the Cuban Missile Crisis was,
about that, yes.
About that. And the concern the Russians had then was the placing of missiles in Turkey by the US.
Right.
So I think that, and as you may know, the Cuban Missile Crisis de-escalated when the US privately
the missiles out. Right.
Pulled the missiles out of Turkey. Right.
Right.
So there are a lot of other things that you can mention about this. But briefly, in Tucker Carlson's credit, he was a neoconservative at one point. He worked for the Weekly Standard under Bill Kristol, but he learned that that was a mistake, and that the liberal interventionists like Hillary Clinton and Bill Kristol are not a whole lot different. They're basically on the same side. So Trump, when he was running for president the first time, was questioning NATO, was raising the question about why the NATO members are not paying their 2% share. And that upset the foreign policy establishment in Washington. Right. And I think that alone set off what ended up being the Russian hoax and the deep state.
You may be
attack.
right.
Yeah, I think they're afraid. Not to say they were not, many of them were not sincerely afraid, but I think also there's interest groups politics about losing their turf and their funding and whatever. But I think that was behind it. And I think what we're seeing now is also an instance of Biden's popularity every week is lower. And this is, I think, clearly a wag the dog moment that the Biden
just as it is for Putin.
As it is for Putin, right. Absolutely.
They get busy getting minds with foreign quarrels, as Shakespeare
this is not
said.
To excuse Putin's interventionism at all.
Right.
But it's to understand the complexity of the situation.
Very complex.
And the West, Putin may well be driven as an egomaniac. He allegedly tried to poison his major rival who survived.
Yeah.
And there are all sorts of things about protests that he's clamped down on and so forth in the Russian Republic. But I think the bottom line is the politics of this. The Ukraine is not a threat to the United States.
Right. What happens there is not really in our strategic perimeter. That's right.
Right. And so we're basically facing a situation of multiple threats to the US, one being a war in the Ukraine, another one being a potential invasion of Taiwan by China. Another is what Iran is going to be up to, and so forth. So I think that the Biden group and the foreign policy establishment are essentially walking us into an incredibly dangerous situation.
Part of it is they have the Munich syndrome. So the Munich syndrome is, well, in every crisis, dig in, don't negotiate really, just you hurl ultimatums at the other side. Otherwise, you're Neville Chamberlain and you're giving a green light to Hitler to do whatever he wants.
Yeah.
Well, okay, so Hitler is one thing, and we have to take each situation in its own historical context and in terms of the actors in that situation, and not say everything is Munich, because that's just not going to lead you anywhere. And so they want, since they have this full plate that David just outlined, the Middle East, Iran, Taiwan, China, and so forth, they have this theory that if they are, for some reason, reasonable in trying to solve the Ukraine crisis, that will have a domino effect in the other problems that they face, some of which they've also created.
Before we move on, just as a reminder, we are live with this conversation, and we're joined by a bunch of our friends across various platforms, including Facebook and YouTube and ThinkSpot. And I've got a live comment from someone who's with us right now that I think deserves a response from us. Someone named Lee says, you can take the man out of the KGB, but you can't take the KGB out of the man. I would never trust Putin. Okay. Thank you, Lee, for that comment.
I certainly wouldn't.
No, I wouldn't either.
No, I don't think any of us do, but I think
he's an autocrat.
I think we would also, speaking of trust, I would say the German government, instead of getting rid of its coal plants and getting rid of its nuclear power plants, shouldn't be trusting Putin. And, what are they? This yes, nuclear power has some kinds of subsidies in various countries and should have tort liability and things like that. But
yes,
the fact of the matter is that they're they're decommissioning their nuclear power plants this year, the last of them, and they're getting rid of their coal plants. So all the Germans have is natural, I mean, not all they have, but a major thing they have. So they get about a quarter of their energy from natural gas, and they get 50% of their natural gas currently from Russia. And when they get Nord Stream 2, which is built but not open yet, when that goes online, it will double the capacity of natural gas coming in from Russia. So they are this is their back door in a sense. If they are concerned about this, it's not in the US's vicinity, it's in Germany's vicinity. And if they want to help a neighbor, maybe that's much more reasonable than World War III.
I mean, I would say, to our friend who sent the note in to us just now, no way that I would trust Putin. But because we agree that Putin is not to be trusted, it does not logically follow from that the United States should risk a major international conflict for the principle of Ukrainian membership in NATO.
Yeah, one person described a war in the Ukraine is a war for democracy to the death of the last American.
Right. Nice.
Also, one other sort of stepping back point is
it's not that democratic a country, by the way. It's
it's
better than Russia.
Yeah, better than Russia. Right. This one issue that came out with the aftermath of 9/11 was the realization by a lot of people that there are federal laws against Americans funding and supporting foreign wars. And in other words, raising money, organizing people that would then come to the defense or whatever of people in the Mideast or whatever, and that's still in effect.
Like the Lafayette Escadrille in World War I. Well, I think it should be allowed, just like that.
Yeah, that's right. And so this
anti-filibustering in the old meaning of filibuster.
Right. And so the letters of marque provision in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution was there so that Congress could authorize bonded agents who could go to defend and rescue and so forth, but they would be held accountable for what they did. All of that has been neutralized. And I think that also means that people only turn to state actors, which is clearly a more dangerous approach.
Yeah, clearly. Okay, I'm going to ask us to change the subject unless you have a last comment on this, Bill.
No, I'm ready to turn to crime. Okay. If we could turn to crime.
Before we turn to crime, I want to turn to money.
Inflation. All right.
Yeah, I mean, let's talk about inflation a little bit. Back in July of last year, President Biden.
Inflation is just temporary, isn't it?
Well, that's what I was going to say. In July of 2021, President Biden said it's going to be temporary. And by November, he was admitting as how maybe it might be a little longer than temporary. But then as of last month, 40-year high of inflation, 7% was the annual percentage measured last month in December.
Well, the Fed chairman, Jerome Powell, said it was temporary too.
Yeah, he said the same thing. Yeah. Well, and then on Monday, of course, President Biden really basically made the lifetime career of a Fox correspondent who asked him a question about inflation. Peter Doocy said, do you think inflation is a political liability? And President Biden muttered under his breath in a hot mic, apparently, no, it's a great asset. More inflation, what a blankety blank, he said. I won't repeat the words.
That was what he said.
This is a family program.
Yeah, right. So David got as close to it as we need to for a family program. And Peter Doocy may have had his career just made by the president, but there's a reality that needs to be discussed here. What's really driving inflation? And are the drivers actually showing any signs of receding? So if you will allow me for a moment, indulge me, I wanted to play a clip from, it was a few months ago, but very pertinent, from our senior fellow, Judy Shelton. Before I play, Dave, would you remind us about Judy and who she is?
Yes, Judy is a financial monetary economist. She was nominated to the Federal Reserve under Trump and was going to be elected at the last minute. One of the senators was diagnosed with COVID, so he couldn't be present, so they didn't have the vote. So they postponed it. And then when Biden took office, he removed her as a nominee.
Okay, so
And
I'm gonna play this.
She's been having a piece of the Wall Street Journal roughly every couple of months, critically looking at this whole issue of inflation of the Fed and the economy.
Yeah, she's very impressive. This is just a very short, like a minute long is all. I'll just play this clip where she's being interviewed on Fox Business by Larry Kudlow.
Caused it and how to fix it with senior fellow at the Independent Institute and former Trump economic advisor, my great pal, Judy Sheldon. Judy, welcome back. So, all right, you've been covering this and covering this. What caused it? What caused it? Is it the pandemic? Is it the Biden budget's going to reduce inflation? Is it the Fed? What is it exactly?
Well, the Biden budget is not going to reduce inflation. We'll start with that.
You think?
And the Fed is primarily responsible for stable prices. I think that's the most important part of its dual mandate. But both fiscal policy and monetary policy are complicit in bringing about this high inflation.
So, okay, that's an important point. They're spending and borrowing, the federal government, actually more than we did through all of World War II, according to Joe Manchin's people.
Yeah.
Very interesting. And the Fed is indirectly financing it. They buy bonds from the banks. They don't buy it directly. But so those two, that's what, it's not just the supply shortages, it's not just the Port of Los Angeles. It's too much government spending and too much money printing from the Fed. That's your take on this?
Yes, I think that the Fed has made it far too easy and too comfortable for the federal government to engage in irresponsible spending. The Fed owns a quarter of all of the Treasury debt out there, so they've distorted that market. But by purchasing that debt, I think that they've made it just too easy, and in that sense have facilitated this excessive fiscal stimulus.
Okay, gentlemen, has Judy got it right?
I think she has it exactly right.
Exactly.
So as massive spending, she was nice about it, and the fact that she didn't mention that the Trump had COVID relief that was quite large, but certainly the Biden people doubled down on that. She's right that fiscal and monetary policy have been intertwined so that they are both responsible. So there's this heavy spending, and there's monetization of the debt, which she talked about, and that's the printing of the money, and that's the primary driver of the inflation. That's not to say that supply chain problems aren't thrown into it. That's not to say that certain aspects of this are also found in other countries around the world. They've also been engaged in massive spending and building up their debt in order to pay for their spending. But that is the correct diagnosis that she just made, and that the Trump budget ideas, which were still viable back when that interview was made, were not going to contribute to it. The last thing I would say, though, is this gets built up because they've already done this monetization. So you can't somehow, you can turn it off in the sense that Volcker did by upping interest rates and generally stopping this process. And that can lead to a bad correction in the sense of, it's a good correction in the sense that the correction is needed, but it's unpleasant, uncomfortable when it happens. But you can't easily just sort of taper off, which supposedly they were going to try and do, but we haven't seen much sign of it yet.
One of our participants just tossed me this comment. The problem is the lack of fiduciary responsibility by our public serpents.
Yes.
He says, public serpents.
Serpents, that's right.
That's a great misspelling.
Yeah,
public serpents at the trough. That's right.
Mm-hmm.
And now our metaphor is really mixed.
Right. And the response by Senator Elizabeth Warren is to say that, well, inflation is being caused, i.e. higher prices, by greedy grocery stores and grocery chains. And anybody who knows about the grocery business knows that at most, their profit margin is about 1%. She particularly attacked Kroger, and their margin is about 75 cents.
Those grocery stores are barely hanging in there. It's a very tough business.
My wife used to have a home delivery grocery supermarket business in San Francisco, and she can tell you about how tough that is, basically on the grocery margins. Okay. And of course, Warren is a political actor and opportunist, but she's delusional about these things. And as a progressive, she believes that government is a solution. She doesn't, she has no problem with the expansion of the debt and so forth. And in fact, other progressives are even defending inflation. So it all goes back to the same point, that if you do not support people making their own choices and you centralize power, which essentially overrules that or dictates choices, you end up with problems. And money is central to any complex economy, and the Fed's actions are setting us up for bad times ahead unless we can stop what's going on.
I want to say something about some of the journalistic descriptions of this inflation. So they're saying, well, all this money going out in the government programs are creating large consumer demand. So all this money is out there, and that consumer demand is fueling inflation. And then recovering from the COVID lockdowns and COVID control policies is scrambling the supply side a bit, which I think is correct. But this demand theory neglects the money side of inflation, the money creation side, which in their slightly different ways, both the Milton Friedman School and the Murray Rothbard, Ludwig von Mises School put at the central point of inflation.
Or money chasing the same number of goods means the price of the goods goes up.
Yeah.
The great irony, of course, behind all of this is that the great increase in government spending is always done, somehow under the justification for the public good and
helping the poor,
supposedly, and especially helping the poor. And yet, by that motivation of helping the poor and dramatically expanding government spending, it then has this undertow which pulls the poor further down because it's trying to help them. And surely
the poor, the widows and orphans that are on fixed
incomes, yeah,
these are the main victims, clearly.
And the financing of government spending, which is borrowed beyond, tax revenues, we have to borrow every year dramatic amounts of money. That financing process then skews wealth towards those elements of society and even internationally capable of lending money.
Yes.
Which means that the income inequality is dramatically exacerbated by this spending and borrowing policy. Income inequality is therefore driven by the drive to help the poor, but it's by an ill-informed drive to help the poor.
Well, let's put it slightly differently. Okay, so we're not against justly arrived at income inequality. If somebody is serving consumers and making wise business decisions and trades and so forth and does well, okay, they honestly have the income that they receive, and it might be more than somebody else. But dishonest business activities, unjust government, incorrect government activities, that is an artificial, unnatural kind of inequality that we disapprove of. It's not so much the inequality, it's the illicit wealth that we're talking about, the illicit.
Yeah, but it also, one of the reasons why it's a problem morally is because it keeps people down.
Yes.
Who through a productive economy would rise up.
Exactly right. Very good point, David.
Right. And so it's basically pits Wall Street against Main Street.
Yeah.
Is what it,
and
what
it holds
ends up
down
doing.
it holds down noble strivers
Mhm.
who are trying to advance their families.
And
Right,
it also skews the investment viewpoint of financial people to invest in quick money through different financial instruments instead of investing in plant and equipment that would create more productivity.
Exactly true.
And so there are firms,
and so
there are firms that exist today that take advantage of it and deliberately target manufacturing firms and others to take over because they can make a quick buck, even though, and it's because the real price of money has been skewed and distorted. They don't even see the difference, but it's not anything that could be called equitable or moral, or certainly
so
economically
certainly
efficient.
many of these businessmen that are doing this are blind to
Yes,
the injustice of it, and we,
Right.
it's understandable, but
Right.
it's certainly bad policy.
But you know what's funny about this is that, while Bill, you're quite right that you and I, and probably David too, we don't think that income inequality is intrinsically a bad thing. It's only a bad
Right.
thing if it's arrived at in these
Unjustly, right?
unjustly. However, it's interesting to note that people who think that way, who are not against income inequality in principle,
Right.
actually have common cause with people who do think that
Yes.
income
Yes,
inequality.
that's right. That's
is
right. We can be
intrinsically
their allies,
We can be allies, exactly.
and we can try and explain to them where we share things and why we think slightly differently in other aspects of it. So
Right.
yes, we can find allies that don't like this strange machinery of kleptocratic money expansion.
well, what it is, it's a government financial redistribution of wealth,
Right.
and that's the problem. What
Right,
you
but
want to
it's
have
in
it
the
so that
wrong direction.
And
Right.
certain leftists don't like where that money's going. We're not so upset as they are about who exactly is getting it, although we don't want them to get it either. But the process is something we definitely frown on. I think
and the bottom line is that it destroys opportunity for people who are not successful, who want to be successful,
and could have been.
Could have been. That's right.
So I think this being a crime, I think we should go to the normal meaning of crime.
Yeah, go ahead. You had some comments on the surge in crime, Bill.
Well, it's not so much that I have anything new to say about the numbers. I mean, obviously, people in our cities are besieged, and the murder rates are going up, and the carjackings are going up, and so forth. What's interesting is kind of what are the different approaches to it. So the Biden Eric Adams approach, Eric Adams is the new mayor of New York City, is massive gun control and some social worker intervention of various sorts, and some substitution or of social workers for police, or just throwing in many more social workers. So that's one solution. We can't really support. I don't think the three of us can really support that approach.
I like Eric Adams, though. He's better than all the alternatives in New York City.
He's better than de Blasio, and de Blasio had what I would call is the Soros approach. Okay, so we can call it the Soros de Blasio approach. De Blasio is a former mayor. George Soros is a Hungarian currency guy, and he's a big philanthropist. So he supports his ideas through politics. So they want the Biden ideas. So that's the massive gun control and the social workers, but they want more. So they want to end bail, and they want to turn arrests into a kind of revolving door thing. And they want to lower felony theft to, if it's less than $500 or it's less than $1,000, it's just a misdemeanor, and basically you're out the door. We don't even bother to prosecute you, probably. Now, then they also want to knock down many felonies to misdemeanors, and they want police accountability. So some of this is all right, some of it's not all right. So we at Independent Institute, I think we don't have an exact line where everybody has to have exactly the same view, but I think
definitely not.
Anyway, the point is, I think in general, we would oppose gun control. We would oppose this flood of social workers. Just is not probably, there's no reason to believe that's going to affect things, particularly. We oppose this no bail approach and the revolving door. But and we would oppose the reduction, the felony theft thing of the $500 and the $1,000. Look, if you're stealing, it's going to be important, for things that are less than $500 should be hit pretty hard. But some of the things we do think they have something on. So the knockdown of certain felonies to misdemeanors, we can, depending on what they are, we could look at that. I think that was something also the Trump people were willing to look at. We're willing to look at police accountability, which is something that the Soros people want to look at, and something that Trump people were not really willing to bite the bullet on. I mean, they kind of talked about it behind closed doors, but they never really could get to the idea of lowering the immunity that police have, and
Yes.
that we were talking about earlier with regard to the Supreme Court. So it's interesting, and that the different people have these different approaches. I think ours makes the most sense. It's a defense of civil liberties, but it's really tough on actual crime, violent crime, anti-property crime, destructive things like arson, rapes, murders. All these things should be tough on them while preserving civil liberties.
I think one way to understand the difference is the Soros people, including DAs that Soros has funded in San Francisco and LA and Chicago and other places.
New York.
Right? They believe they're motivated by the concept of social justice.
Yeah.
So justice is a way to balance out and redistribute accountability and responsibility. Those that are more successful are guilty by definition, and you won't be treated the same way. And the ones that allegedly are the victims of the oppressed will not be treated the same way. So,
right, but that's
one side of it. The other side of it is the idea of individual accountability of everyone in the system.
Personal responsibility,
the police,
individual,
the robber, the property owner,
exactly,
the mother, the child, the judge, whatever.
Yeah.
They're all responsible, and that's the classic
liberal position, classical
English,
liberal conservative position, Anglo-American, right?
Right, exactly, and that was the bedrock of Western civilization. Is that view?
It can go wrong. It can go off the rails sometimes, but let's pull it back on the rails.
Right, but that's the model, and so we're essentially judging these different proposals based on that and the history of that. Now, it deals with environmental issues, it deals with property crime, it deals with all sorts of things. But the social justice approach essentially is to say that is the problem. We want to move away from it, and we're going to essentially make individuals not accountable in many instances and overly accountable in other instances when they're not responsible. So you end up with this chaos, anarchy, essentially, in the area of criminal justice. And so that's what we're seeing now in these cities. The cities, people are not being held accountable. If someone is in Antifa, they're let loose. I mean, it's across the board. So
I want to say something though, that some of this may be rhetoric, and the reality may be something different. I'm reminded of this by a very interesting case. So during the National Socialist rule in Europe, a family had an art collection that was confiscated by the Germans, and it had a Pizarro painting in it. He was an impressionist painter. And so the thing went through various hands and is now somebody's possession. So the family that originally had this before it was seized want it back, the heirs. And so one of the most connected people in the Democratic establishment, Stuart Eisenstadt, who was the head of domestic policy under President Carter and has been hugely influential ever since, is defending the people that are the holders of the stolen property. So, sometimes these people talk an interesting social justice game. Eisenstadt himself has been, very concerned about the looting of art and injustices to Jews, I think, which are both important topics. But it's interesting that connected somehow, the privileged somehow get a better deal out of it if they're connected to the political establishment.
Right. And that's the way this view of socializing responsibility ends up, is that those at the top,
right, and their friends and the people that are well organized, right,
right, and they get the money and they get to rule over others and not be held accountable.
I think that's right. So it's both. If they had it the way they're rhetorically talking about, it wouldn't be good. But the reality of how it actually works out, accompanied by this rhetoric, is even more horrifying. So
interestingly, this means that, for example, David, I know that you are opposed to the conferral of qualified immunity on police officers and police departments and so forth. But that's really only one instance of the larger phenomenon that you're talking about, which I think is the rule of law equally applied to everyone with equal responsibility and no governmentally conferred carve-outs from
you can always, let's say if you have a business firm, all right, Bechtel used to be based in California. They used to have the largest police force in California because they had all these facilities they had to secure.
Mm-hmm.
So Bechtel could have a contract with the employees in their security firm to limit liability. The point is that limited contract liability does not extend to others.
Mm-hmm.
So so the problem with the qualified immunity provision in public police is that it essentially eliminates accountability.
Right.
It's imposed on us, the citizens.
Right. It's imposed on the citizens and those
who Bechtel was in no position to do.
Right. And so that's the difference. And so now police officers themselves are in this vice because they're being pulled in multiple directions at the same time, and they don't see a way out.
It's very unfair to them in many ways.
Many are quitting.
Exactly.
Right. So I think we should try and end on an optimistic note and talk a little bit about Youngkin in Virginia.
Mm-hmm.
What are you thinking, Bill?
Well, I think it's been fabulous so far. First of all, of course, just him winning was an amazing thing. As the election went along, it became more clear that he might win, but he was running against an incumbent who was a major figure in the Democratic establishment, a top fundraiser, top operative.
He had been an incumbent in a previous term.
Right, right. That's correct.
Very, very close to the Clinton machine.
A top figure in the Clinton machine.
Right.
So since he's come in, he's done a lot of great things. It's particularly in my own field of education, which was a major point in the campaign. So part of this whole mobilization that ended up supporting him had to do with critical race theory, people not letting parents speak or influence decisions in K-12 education, crimes that were going on. There were situations where transsexual people were committing crimes and it was kind of being covered up. Multitude of things, but the basic thing was anti-parent.
Girl sports were part of it.
Anti-parent attitude on the part of the elites and the left and the Democratic Party. So since he's come in, they had a woke math program that was anti-advanced work, and it was trying to put politics into math instruction. I know the listeners might think that's crazy. How could they do that? But I promise you, I'm a specialist in studying this. I just wrote a long essay on this with another individual co-authoring, and so he ended that. He's ended critical race theory. They're not allowed to teach it. I do want to qualify this correct reluctance to have, it's correct to not want to have critical race theory shoved down the throats of K through 12 students or impose on teachers that they have to teach it. But as pointed out by Paul Krugman, who, like a broken watch, is right once a day, he did say
twice a day.
Twice a day. Yes.
Twice.
True. Okay. Well, he's right on two things, so that's good. He's right on protectionism, and he's also right that if you say you can't, as a student, be uncomfortable, you can't have something that makes you feel bad, that's outlawed in the classroom. And that's
criterion.
That's going too far. And there are a number of statutes. He had a column this last week pointing out that there are some of these proposed statutes that have this provision. I'm not saying Virginia does, but it's out there. So the last thing that Youngkin did that has to do with this issue of education is he has a diversity officer, an inclusion officer in the Virginia government. So it's been for diversity, equity, and inclusion, but they took out the equity, which is a code word for radical egalitarianism on the left, and they changed it to opportunity. And they appointed a Heritage Foundation person, Angela Saylor.
Former,
right. She's no longer, because she's doing this new job. Right. And he tasked her with looking out for economic opportunity, looking out for free speech on campus, looking out to see that history is taught objectively in the schools, among other things, religious toleration, a variety of really excellent things. So I think, many of these are things that have symbolic value, and we won't necessarily see things, but we're seeing them dropping the critical race theory and the woke math, and that's all to the good. I really commend him, and I hope he sticks with this.
As a former, for a decade or so, Virginian, I am happy for my former state and hoping that my long-term and current state, California, can take a few lessons from it. I mean, probably should stop on this point, but I know, Bill, we got some good news that bears on one of your initiatives recently. You've been drawing attention to California's ethnic studies curriculum, which has been a cloak for all sorts of racism and bias.
Right.
Actually, a part of that curriculum had been the inclusion of a chant that school children were supposed to chant to Aztec gods as an expression of their solidarity and somehow social responsibility.
Well, it was more an empathy idea or something, living, putting yourself in the shoes of others. But it turned out, so there are several Aztec gods involved. One of them is the one that they had custom was to offer human sacrifice to this particular god.
Yep.
And many parents, I think, correctly balked at this. Christopher Rufo publicized it quite extensively. And as Graham is saying, the State Department of Education has backed off and has written settlement said that it will not include this in the model curriculum.
So
I think that's great.
California students will not be obliged to say prayers to Aztec gods after all, even for the sake of
nor
empathy.
to engage in human sacrifice. We hope.
Yeah, and to be clear, no one in the state was ever advocating the actual implementation.
I agree. That was just a humorous aside.
Well, two tiny things I would add. One is that in the Youngkin situation, also in California with Bill, the issue of critical race theory is not so much an academic freedom issue, there's that. It's really an issue of teaching children that they're racist.
Right.
That's the issue.
And the law that is often being attacked. So in Mississippi, they just passed a law on this, and the Democratic state senators all walked out. But what the law said was, you shall not teach people that one race is superior or inferior to another. I think that's perfectly reasonable for this legislature to say that.
Yep,
and it shouldn't. These teachers are employees. It's not some kind of highfalutin academic freedom that they could teach their children that are under their care that some races are superior and some are inferior. That's not the government's business to be teaching that.
Absolutely.
That's bad,
And
evil, I would say, for them.
yeah, and the other point is this.
And Democrats should be ashamed for walking out from something like that.
And this slogan, diversity, inclusion, equity, to Jordan Peterson's credit, he's reversed the order. So instead of I guess it's
DEI, he says it's DIE.
Right, DIE. So right. So instead of diversity, equity, inclusion, he's reversing the order. So it's DIE.
Yeah.
And he's saying that we have to stop DIE, which is going to essentially kill us,
right, and our
society.
civilization.
Right.
So he has left University of Toronto because
he's emeritus now, but he's not on the tenured faculty.
Right. And it's basically because the milieu, the culture there was just so impossible. How could he have a graduate student or something, or be training up successors in the atmosphere in which he found the anti-intellectual, anti-human?
He would not genuflect before the principles of woke culture. And that's why it came to that conclusion. I would just point out that here at Independent Institute, if you want to see what he said, we have posted his statement on his departure from the University of Toronto on our website. Why I am no longer a professor.
I commend people reading it also. I think it's worth reading.
You can go to our website for a lot of other very timely analyses. You can always go to independent.org. We try and give you our freshest thinking on the current topics. And I would point out, perhaps some of you are astonished, but we actually, the three of us, can have an hour-long conversation without talking about COVID.
Next time.
So let me just say, give you both of you parting shots. David, any parting shots? What do you think we're going to be talking about 2 weeks hence?
I think we're going to be talking about the Supreme Court and the Fed and what's going to happen in the Ukraine.
Parting shots from you, Bill.
I just want to mention two things. One is that Terry Teachout, who was a great cultural critic, particularly for the Wall Street Journal and for commentary, historian of jazz, wrote some drama play about Louis Armstrong, died recently. He was a wonderful part of American culture, and it's a big loss. And another thing that happened in sort of cultural war is they removed the statue of Theodore Roosevelt from in front of the Natural History Museum in New York City. And it's interesting that the African on the one side and the American Indian on the other side, they were meant to be noble figures. They were meant to be the gun bearers and guides for him on his hunting and exploration trips. And I'm not a fan of Theodore Roosevelt. I think, in many ways, he was a Bismarck, German style centralizer. He was a anticipator of many. He was a progressive. I mean, he was the presidential candidate of the Progressive Party, but in many ways, he was an ancestor with some changes here and there of the contemporary progressives of our time. So I'm not a big fan of his, but I think the statue was willfully misinterpreted.
Yes.
And he was a guy who was very interested in natural history, among many things.
And very appropriate to be in front of that museum.
Yes, that's right. He was involved in the creation of the institution there. And, he's a big fan of Hamilton and Gouverneur Morris and people that are not my favorites in American history. But he's part of American history. And to take his statue down arbitrarily like this kind of seems like an ugly thing to have done.
Yeah.
And it cost how much again?
$1 million.
$1 million, yeah.
Good grief.
To take it down.
Okay. With that said, thank you both. Thank you, David.
I have a photo of myself when I was a child in front of that.
Cool.
I'd love to see that later. So thank you, David. Thank you, Bill. Pleasure to have both of you. Thank you for all of our friends who've joined us from far and near. Please do visit our website, independent.org. We can give you a lot of interesting insight from there. And join us again in a couple of weeks for the next episode of Independent Outlook. From the San Francisco Bay Area, we wish you all the best from Independent Institute. Take care.